Okay, we do welcome you to our Bible class with our study in the book of Isaiah. We are taking a deeper, closer look at Isaiah chapter 53. Today, we are more specifically looking at Isaiah 53, 3 and 4, and the concept that is brought out there. And you might be looking at Matthew chapter 8, verse 16. And we established a particular principle out of Isaiah 51:19 concerning God using different language to say the same thing, as he talked about the sword and destruction, as he talked about famine and devastation. He used those things interchangeably. Well, that's what we learned with Matthew 8 and Isaiah 53, 3 and 4. I'm reading Isaiah 53, 3 and 4. Isaiah would predict that the Messiah was despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. As one from whom men hide their face, he was despised. We esteemed him not. Verse 4. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. Now, as you hold your finger there and you emphasize the two words griefs and sorrows that the Messiah would carry, you now are looking at Matthew, and Matthew is recording that Jesus fulfilled this passage. Notice the context as to how Matthew says he fulfilled it. Matthew 8:16. And when he was come, they brought unto Jesus many possessed with demons, and he cast out the spirits with a word, and he healed all that were sick, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken through Isaiah the prophet, saying, himself took our infirmities and bare our diseases. What you need to do is recognize that they're both talking about the same thing. Matthew is pointing out how Jesus fulfilled Isaiah 53, verse 4. Someone says, well, they used different words, and they did. But we do know they're talking about the same thing, since Matthew connects the concepts of Isaiah to the miracles of Jesus. We then decline the idea that Isaiah is speaking of sin. I emphasize that because in times past, I've taken all of these verses to refer to sin. But since Matthew has specifically made a specific connection, then we have to figure out his hermeneutics, his understanding of how to understand a passage. Thus, we brought in the idea of Isaiah 51, verse 19, that there is the sword that would bring about the devastation. There was the famine that would bring about it's the other way around, destruction. And so we see how the Bible would interpret a certain thing. And that's what's going on as you compare these two passages. They were cast down with infirmities and diseases. That's Matthew. Matthew is pointing out that the people were cast down. They were hurting with the diseases and the sickness that they had. And Jesus felt their grief and sorrow. And that's Isaiah. That is the point that's being made with the two passages and the interpretation that God would give it, and Isaiah 51:19 being the help in that hermeneutics. The wording of Isaiah emphasizes the emotion of the Messiah that he was going to have when he came to the earth. The emotion of grief, the emotion of sorrow, the idea of compassion, the idea of feeling the hurt from the people. Isaiah predicted that. Now, as he helps with their infirmities, the wording of Matthew helps us to emphasize what he's emphasizing, and that is there was a needed help by the Messiah, and so the miracles would occur in order to help them with their infirmities and their diseases. Here's something that has stood out through the years. Isaiah predicts the compassion of Jesus Christ. And you see the compassion as he deals with the people who are hurting. I realize that the atheistic world wants to say that there is no compassion with God, or else he would stop all of the diseases and the affliction and the pain that man goes through. No, that's not true. The atheist doesn't understand what God is doing. God does. Well, God just doesn't have any love and compassion. Yes, he does. But he's also got a plan. And we have to be sure that we understand his plan. What you see with Jesus Christ is a total contrast with what the people of that day see and hear and feel. They were ruled by Rome. The power of Rome ruled their country, the Jews. And what they saw with that power of Rome was cruelty and conquering. On the other hand, what Matthew is bringing out is that Jesus also had power. But with his power, he would manifest compassion and caring. We need to see what this passage, Isaiah 53, is predicting 700 years before it came to pass. We need to see its fulfillment as Matthew records exactly what Jesus did and how he felt as well in a host of other verses. And so as we look at Isaiah, we recognize that he has compassion. But Jesus was a man of grief and sorrow and compassion, and he still is. Turn with me to Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14. Hebrews 4, 14. We start with verse 14 so that we can see the context of what the Hebrew writer is saying. Having then a high priest who hath passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we have not a high priest that cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities. You'll notice that Paul, and I think he's the writer of the book of Hebrews, that he put it as a double negative. We have not a high priest that cannot be touched. He put two negatives in there. What you can do to see exactly what's being said, yet it's powerfully stated the way Paul has stated it. Just take the not out. We have a high priest who can be touched with our infirmities. And the word that Paul is using in that particular text is a feeling with. A feeling with. We have a high priest that can be touched with the feelings of our infirmities. He feels what we feel because he became human. See the plan of God in comparison to what the atheist would tell us? Instead of God just removing all the pain, God sent his Son to show that it's more powerful. His plan is more powerful than the plan of atheists and other men. We discussed a while back the British psychologists who have presented evidence as to the empathy, the sympathy, the feeling with others that we have. They had a study. And 1/3 of the group that would view this study, as they were watching and as they were involved in the study, 1/3 of the people would feel the same pain, would feel the same grief, and they would feel the same sorrow as those they were viewing. As I read that, I thought, well, Jesus goes into that 1/3 because he too feels and felt what he saw, and he did something about it. I want you now to turn your attention to Matthew chapter 9. And we're going to look at several times where the Bible declares that Jesus had compassion. The word, though there are 6 different words in the original, in the Greek, that would help us to get across the idea of compassion and mercy and feeling of infirmity and empathy and sympathy. We're only looking at one word in these 6 occasions. The word that is being used and translated as compassion in these passages is to be moved as in one's bowels, to be moved with compassion. There's a whole story behind why they would define it that way. But I know that we have a number of examples in life that helps us to see that. This past week in America, we had a young man who had an officer's knee on his neck. A little bit of cruelty. A lot of cruelty. A big show of force by an officer that need not do that. My discussion is not that officer. I'm just calling your attention that everybody understands that I'm talking about George Floyd. Now, the world has responded a certain way. I was watching last night a lady by the name of Liz Wheeler. She's on One America News Network. And she was expressing having seen the video where the officer had his knee on George Floyd's neck. And she made this statement. Watching it made me sick to my stomach. I couldn't find a better example at the moment than that. That is our word for compassion. It makes you sick to your stomach. You are moved within. The first example we look at is Jesus demonstrated compassion in his preaching and teaching those that were scattered, confused, and cast down. Matthew 9:35. Matthew writes, Jesus went about all the cities and the villages, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom and healing all manner of disease and all manner of sickness. But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion for them because they were, American Standard says, distressed. King James says, faint, and scattered as sheep, not having a shepherd. They were in distress, and he sees that. And that distress is a destructive concept. And as you look and you see that they were scattered as sheep without a shepherd, it draws the picture as to sheep being in distress. He's not calling us animals. He's simply drawing a parallel so that we can, they could, especially since they were shepherds, they could see what was meant by sheep who were in distress. When you've got a wolf in front of you as a sheep, as a human being, you're going to be in distress. And that's the way he's looking at the people of that day and time. The extreme pain or suffering, the anguish of body or mind as to suffer distress from sickness, such as the sickness mankind goes through today, or that he was looking at in that day and time, or from the loss of friends. A lot of times this is the way we feel when we lose somebody that's close to us. That which occasions suffering, painful situation, misfortune, affliction, misery. These people were wearied and cast down. Their physical, their mental, and their spiritual welfare was in distress. And it was felt by the Messiah. That's what's being said in this text. Jesus feels our distress when we go through these things. Secondly, Jesus demonstrated compassion in feeding the hungry. Matthew 15, just a couple of chapters forward. Now, this happened more than once as he would feed 4,000 and he would feed 5,000. In Matthew 15:32, and Jesus called unto him his disciples, and he said, I have compassion on the multitude, because they continue with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. I would not send them away fasting, lest happily they faint on the way. What you have is Jesus asking them, what do you have to feed them with? And they said 7 loaves and a few small fish. And so he was able to feed 4,000, Mark tells us. And so the Lord recognized, look, they've been following me without eating. How many people would go without food? I know a lot of people follow Jesus in order to get something. But these people are following, listening to his teaching and his preaching. And they've been doing it for 3 days. And so they are hungry, and he would feed them. He would feed them because of his compassion. Now, we need to recognize that when we are hungry, when we're really hungry, God knows it, and God feels it. Oh, why didn't he zap? Just put some food on the table right quick. That's not the plan. When we get into heaven and we recognize the full plan of God and what he's doing, I'm not discussing it right now, but when we get into heaven and we recognize how great God is and how much greater he loves us than what we can even come close to in his compassion toward us, we'll understand what's going on even more. So Jesus demonstrated compassion in preaching and teaching those who were in distress, in feeding the hungry. Matthew 14:14, Jesus demonstrated compassion in healing the various diseases. We probably see this more than the other, but it's just a part of the other. It's part of the things that would cause someone to be sick to the stomach. Matthew 14:14, and he came forth and he saw a great multitude, and he had compassion on them, and he healed them. The sick in this particular text is Ronumi. And when you put a alpha privative before it, it says not. Say it another way, Ron. It means strong. And then you put an alpha privative before it, and it says not. They were weak. They were not strong. I've told you this particular illustration before, but every time I read of compassion and mercy and the moving and the being sick at the stomach, it reminds me of when we went to the General Hospital. I can't really remember why we went there, but we had a 55 Ford, and it had 4 doors, if I remember right, maybe 2 doors. It was 2 doors, and the kids were sitting in the back. Donna, the youngest daughter, the best daughter in Oklahoma City, Yukon area. I like to say, she's 2 or 3 years old. She grabbed hold of the post, and the driver shut the door. I'll tell you what, it shut on her fingers. That makes you sick to your stomach. You know what I'm talking about. You've done that. You've dropped something on your toe. Uh-oh, that's the oldest daughter. Wanda, last week, is walking along, and she doesn't know the terrain where she's walking. I shouldn't laugh about this. She hit her toe on a rebarb that was sticking up. And you know your whole body just aches for that toe. Well, that's what Jesus felt. He felt what Wanda felt. He felt what we as a family felt toward Donna whenever she would have her finger caught, it just weakens you. It just weakens you all over, and you can't hardly even stand up. You will notice that Jesus in this Matthew in this particular text listed the diseases, and there would be diseases such as leprosy. Sometimes you can't really think of anything worse than leprosy when it's at its worst. There were legs replaced, feet replaced, arms, hands replaced. And when Jesus saw people like that, he just felt with them. I'm sure you guys are getting the same commercial we are concerning St. Jude's Hospital, Children's Hospital. And you see these little kids come out. And we started watching the dark-headed kid, the boy, when he was young, and now he's 20 years old, I think. But they have hands missing and feet missing and legs missing, and they can hardly walk, and they can. But some of them are just full of joy, and your heart just goes out to them. That's Jesus. That's Jesus. He would heal the sick, those that were deaf. Again, what an opportunity we have in America to relate to these things. What you can do, and it's easy to do, and you see it probably once a month, once a week, there'll be a report somewhere of a young baby hearing for the first time, or a young mother hearing for the first time. Or what I saw was a young lady, I guess she was in her 20s, and she was able to hear for the first time, and she heard her fiance, her boyfriend say, "Will you marry me?" That's some of the first words she got to hear. And you know, every one of these females, they're just crying buckets of tears because of being able to hear. It's really a joy that they are able to. Now, what you want to do is take that joy and go back to the first century. They didn't have the cochlear hearing aid that these people have today. They were healed immediately. And they could hear, and they could jump up and walk. Jesus' compassion is manifested in those things. You also have those that are blind. They cannot see, and Jesus would heal them as well. I'm turning to Matthew 20. Matthew 20. This is about two blind men. One of them's name is Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, Bartimaeus. That's the one that's named. And it's been suggested he was named by the scriptures because he was somebody that was known. And so they're passing and making sure everybody understands. All you have to do is go over and see Bartimaeus, and you will recognize he's different now. Listen to the occasion in Matthew 20:30. And behold, two blind men sitting by the wayside, when they heard that Jesus was passing by, cried out, saying, "Lord, have mercy." There's one of our words. Have mercy. Show compassion, is what he just said. On us, thou son of David. The multitude, of course, rebuked them, that they should hold their peace. But they cried out the more, saying, "Lord, have mercy. Show us in action compassion upon us. We know who you are. We know what you can do. We've had the reputation repeated to us." Remember, Matthew 20 is near the end of his life. Verse 32, Jesus stood still, and he called them, and he said, "What will ye that I should do unto you?" And they said, "Lord, that our eyes may be open." Jesus, moved with compassion, touched their eyes, and straightway they received their sight and followed him, being moved with compassion because these two men were hurting and suffering so greatly. So Jesus was more than willing to help folks who had to suffer time and time again. A fifth example is Jesus, and the scriptures mention compassion. Jesus demonstrated compassion in casting out demons. As we read Mark 9, as we read this account, bring to the forefront and keep an eye, an ear, your attention to the Father. The Father. I realize that this is a passage dealing with what the disciples could not do. But what we also have to see is this is a passage and an example that demonstrates how the Father feels, how Jesus felt, and his compassion. So keep an eye on the Father in the passage. Mark 9:17, and one of the multitude answered him. Verse 21 of the same passage tells us the Father. So the one of the multitude is the Father. Teacher, I brought unto thee my son, who hath a dumb spirit. Look at verse 25, if you would. Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit. The unclean spirit, by textual examination over the New Testament, will show you that he's talking about the spirit that would possess a human body, and that spirit that was possessing a human body was the spirit of a wicked man, wicked person that had died. A spirit possession was allowed in the first century. It did not occur before the first century. It has not occurred since the first century. Let me stop just a moment. Today, because of a great deal of wickedness that is going on in the world, there are a host of folks that are casting out demons because the world is just full of evil. Well, the world certainly is full of evil, but it's not because of demon possession. There is no demon possession today. Men are responsible for their own wickedness today. Yes, in the first century, there were special things going on to manifest the power of Jesus as the only begotten Son of God. Verse 18. And wheresoever it taketh him, this is the Father speaking, it dasheth him down. If you are the Father and you see a bully come up and strike your young son, how are you going to feel? That's what the Father is manifesting in this text. And he foameth. When you see your child being seized with epilepsy, I remember talking to a mother at Lake Homa. Her son had epilepsy, and it bothered her quite a bit. They've progressed quite a bit since then. That's 30 years ago. He grindeth his teeth. He pineth away. I spake unto thy disciples that they should cast it out. They were not able. Indeed, that's a key point. But you need to see the Father as we look at it today. Jesus answered and saith, bring him unto me. Verse 20. They brought the boy unto him, and when he saw him straightway, the spirit tear him grievously. You're the Father, and you're there, and you see that going on. But you've been seeing that for a while. And fell down on the ground and wallowed, foaming. That's embarrassing. Verse 21. And he asked his father, how long time is it since this hath come upon him? From a child, he answered. The Father again speaks. Listen to the Father's feelings. Oft times it hath cast him both into the fire and into the waters, trying to drown him, trying to burn him, to destroy him. But if thou canst do anything, stop just a moment. This man actually said these words. If you can do this. Jesus, if you can do this. if you have the ability. My teachers always taught me that whenever you ask somebody something, you say, may I, instead of can I. When you say can I, that means you have the ability. You don't need to ask somebody, do I have the ability to do it? What you're doing is asking permission when you say, may I? And that's how she demonstrated the difference between may and can. Well, this man used the word can. Jesus, do you have the power? The Lord recognized what he did. But the Father has his mind on his Son, and it's hurting him. If thou canst do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus said unto him, if thou canst? See what Jesus just did? Did you really say that? All things are possible to him that believeth. Now, we're going to discuss this phrase and what it's all about. Right now, I would venture to say that you are interpreting Jesus to have said, Father, if you've got faith, if you've got the belief, all can be done. That's not what he said. Ron, keep reading. Straightway the father of the child cried out and said, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. Do you feel what the father felt? Now let's go back to the idea. See, Ron, the father thought Jesus was talking about him. I realize that. We're going to discuss that in just a second, and you're going to see what I'm trying to drive at with that. But that's not the main, that's a main thought within the text. But right now, what we're trying to drive at is, do you see how the Father has a great deal of compassion for his Son? Jesus, verse 25, rebuked the unclean spirit. I command thee, come out of him, enter no more into him. And having cried out, tore him much, and he came out. So Jesus was able to succeed, of course, because Jesus can do what he was asked to do. Did you feel what the Father felt? Jesus did. Jesus did. And Jesus does. Turn with me to Matthew 17, verse 19, and you see a parallel thought. You see the disciples gather with Jesus after the situation, after they failed to cast out the demon. And they asked the question, why could not we cast it out? Remember, the Father said, if thou canst. He's just gone to the disciples. They couldn't do it. And Jesus said, if thou believest, all things are possible. So the disciples asked the question, why could we not cast it out? All things are possible. Wait a minute. They couldn't. And Jesus said, because of your little faith. You see what he did when he answered the man? If thou canst. Is that what you said? The problem is not with me, said Jesus. The problem was with my disciples and their little faith. And you have an opportunity to help them and help us to recognize a number of New Testament people were healed of their diseases. Whether they manifested faith in Jesus or not was not the problem. I would like to discuss with you Luke chapter 7 and the raising up of the widow of Nain's son. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my attention, and I think I've got about 3 minutes to discuss the compassion of the world of that day and time as far as the philosophies of the day. It's important. Characteristic of the world in which Jesus lived was a philosophy which was espoused by a great number of people, not affected by passion, able to suppress feelings, manifesting or maintaining austere indifference to joy, grief, pleasure, or pain. In this dearth of inhumanity of man toward manity, Jesus came, bringing a fountain flowing with pity and compassion. I want you to hear, if you would, this stoic passion, lack thereof. The Stoics were incapable of feeling. They reasoned that if a man could sorrow or joy, it meant that someone else could affect him, alter his feelings, make him happy or sad. They erroneously surmised that if God could feel sorrow or joy at anything that happens to man, it would mean that man can affect God, and therefore man has power over God. But since it is impossible, they thought, for man to influence God, therefore he must be essentially without feeling. Hence, a divine being would have no compassion. It seems like the Nazis were Stoics. They had no compassion. There are a host of others in the same boat, certainly in the first century. I continue reading, though. A Stoic philosopher wrote of how we should teach and train ourselves not to care when we lose something. He said, quote, "This should be our study from morning to night, beginning from the least and frailest things, from earthen vessel, from a glass. Afterwards proceed to a suit of clothes, a dog, a horse, an estate, from thence to yourselves, your body, parts of the body, your children and children, your wife, brothers. Lose anything, see your nearest and dearest die, and say, 'It doesn't matter, I don't care.'" What a contrast. What a contrast. Isaiah said the suffering servant would be entering into the world, and he would be showing grief and sorrow at those that he knew and saw, as well as those he didn't, in contrast to what was going on in the philosophical world of that day and time. In our worship, we're going to be singing, "I Know He Cares." Oh, yes, He cares. I know He cares. His heart is touched with my grief. When days are weary, the long nights dreary, I know that my Savior cares.